very different. My background, when I came back to university, I had a degree. I'd worked for many years as a school teacher, teaching maths and science in high school back in South Africa. And I had also majored in psychology over there. And then we migrated to Perth, and I had children, they grew up, and I wanted to go back to teaching actually, because that was really my love, that's what I wanted to do. And I became very interested at the time in children with learning difficulties, and that's really been a theme and an interest of mine over the years, because I found when I was teaching high school that some of the issues were not that I dealt with, were not really the content that was difficult. It was the way in which people learned and some of the strategies that they needed to be taught. And also dyslexia at the time, we don't really call it dyslexia anymore, but dyslexia at the time was very much at the forefront, and I'm talking in the 70s, I'm sorry, it's going back quite a while, but in the 70s and the early 80s, when we became much more aware of children who had these difficulties and ways in which we could alleviate those difficulties. So when I came back, it was very much with a background in teaching. I actually, for many years over here, ran a clinic for children with learning difficulties, and was really teaching those children different strategies. And I suppose what I was doing was practicing psychological principles, even though it wasn't sort of mainstream at that particular time. What I wanted to do was actually practice as a psychologist. And in South Africa, 3 years you could become a psych assistant, and that was perfectly acceptable over there. But when I came over here, it was different. You had to have 4 years of training, and then you did 2 years of supervision. And so I came back, and I came back to ECU at the time, and I did my honours in psychology. And I finished that, and then they said to me, well, you've done your honours, why don't you do a master's? You're going to do 2 years supervision. Instead of doing 2 years supervision, why don't you go and do a master's for 2 years? That counts as your supervision, and you can register as a psychologist. I thought, well, that made sense, okay. So that's what I did. I did my master's in psychology at ECU, and I finished my master's, and then they said to me, you know, really, you finished your master's, why don't you now do a PhD? And really, that's the trajectory that I had. Why don't you do a PhD? And you know what? ECU actually offers some scholarships to do a PhD. So we'll actually pay you to do this, and then you can go out and work, and how much better is it to have a PhD than just to have a master's? And I thought, oh, okay, 3 years, that's not too bad. Yep, we could do that, and they're going to pay me to do it anyway, so I don't have to work. This is really a very good way to go. And that's what I did. So I did the PhD, and actually I did it in 3 years, and I finished it and handed it in within 3 years. Well, I thought it was pretty good too, actually. And the rest, I suppose, is sort of history. I'd finished the PhD over here, and this is really where I suppose my research career started to take off a little bit. I had a supervisor over here, and incidentally I was the first PhD student that actually finished within the School of Psychology here at ECU. So I was their first graduate. Now, I had a supervisor who herself, obviously she had a PhD, but she herself was trying to establish her research career. And what she said to me was, look, I'm working with somebody, they're not in our faculty, they're actually in another faculty. But she's the Associate Dean for Research over there, and she's been really helpful to me. Why don't I make a time, you and I will go and talk to her, just see what she's got to offer, because you might find that that'll help you to decide what you want to do and how you want to get there. And that's exactly what happened. I had a meeting with, she's now become, she went from here to Curtin, and then from Curtin she's become Vice Chancellor of, I can't remember, one of
Swinburne.
Swinburne, thank you, John. And it was Lynne Christensen. And psychology was not in that faculty at all. We were in a totally different faculty. And I went along to this meeting, and she sat me down, and I've never, ever forgotten that meeting, ever. Because that was really the start of what, it started to clarify for me what you needed to do if you were going to succeed. This wasn't a haphazard type of arrangement. I had to think about very carefully, where did I want to go to? Where did I see myself in a few years' time? What were the goals that I wanted to achieve? And how did I think I was going to get there? What were my research interests? And we had that meeting, it was about an hour, and then she sent me off. She said, go and think about what we've talked about, and we'll make another time for next week where I want you to come back to me with some of these answers, and we'll talk about them. That's exactly what I did again. Came back to her. I didn't know where I really wanted to go. Actually, where I wanted to go was become a clinician. That's really what I wanted to do. I had absolutely no intention of becoming an academic and remaining at the university, none whatsoever. And we sat down, we spoke about where I thought I was going to go, and she said, well, if you're going to do that and you really want to become a clinician, this is not the place for you to be. She said, you need to go out there. So I said, well, actually, I've applied for a level B position over here now, and I should hear within the next week or two whether I'll get it. And I suppose if I get that position, I'll probably stay here, and I can always do some clinical work part-time as well. And I got that level B position. And I did do clinical work part-time. But at the same time, while I was doing that, Linda had suggested to me that why don't I go along to a research group that she had just established, and she had established many of them, but this was a new one. It was dealing a little bit with psychological principles, around about psychosocial aspects of dealing with cancer. And I thought, well, it's not really my thing, but okay, that's all right, I'll go along. And she said, what it will do for you is, look at the way in which they're working, take whatever you can from this group, it's a good training ground for you. And I thought, okay, she knows what she's talking about, and that's exactly what I did. And for about 18 months, I went along to this research group. Was it my area of expertise? Absolutely not. But it didn't matter. It was in another faculty. Did it matter? Absolutely not. But what it did do was, it created networks for me. It started to give me the idea of collaborating with other people. But what I did do is I watched very, very carefully the way in which that group was managed and the way they operated, and I learned from them. That's what I did. I sat there trying to literally soak up everything I could from these people. How did you apply for grants? How did you organize grant writing when there were 3 or 4 of you who were going to be on this grant together? How did they divvy up the tasks that needed to happen? How did they actually decide to apply for these grants? Which grants did they apply for? Why particular grants? How did you get other people on board who had expertise? And that's when I learned, well, it doesn't all have to be from your institution. You can get people from outside the institution. They've got the name, use those names. They're only too happy, as Ken said, they like to see their names in lights. Absolutely, they do like to see their names in lights. And I found that people were actually very generous with their time and with their names. I learnt about writing articles then. Yes, I'd written some articles from my PhD. Yes, they got published, but I almost thought it was luck more than anything else. I didn't really have a strategy that I was that good at writing, or that I thought I knew exactly where I was going with it. But they taught me, this research group taught me, if you're going to write a paper, how do you structure that paper? How do you get people to work with you? Not writing the paper, but you get critical friends. And that's what I learned from them. So that was a very, very good training ground for me. And I'm ever so grateful to Linda for suggesting and allowing me to join a research group that was really not my area, but the way in which they really embraced you, whether you came from their discipline or not. I suppose I was another body to do some work for them, but that's okay, because as much as they got out of me, I got out of them as well. But at the same time, I was also very, very fortunate. So I had this one experience of Linda mentoring me and through this research group, which was very, very powerful. But I had another mentor that sort of came on board after the 18 months, and that was the head of School of Psychology, who has long since retired. But she was somebody who saw potential and actually got you together, got groups together, and mentored those groups so that they became viable research groups in their own right after a period of time. And what happened for me was that I was interested in two strands, really. One was my research in education, but tied to that was my interest in higher education. And that came over a period of time when I became interested in mentoring in learning communities, and I suppose through the School of Psychology became very interested in this whole aspect of retention and persistence of students at university. And at the time, the School of Psychology was running an attrition rate of about 26%, which was enormous. And we weren't going to survive under those circumstances. So it was that interest of mine that spurred on my research that started in that area, and it was through my being mentored by this particular head of school. And what she did was that she got you together, but she also showed you, again, how to organize and how to run a research group so that everybody was an active participant in that group. There were no hangers on there. If you were interested in that particular area or topic area, then you joined that research group, but you were actually expected to contribute to the development of that group. And you know, over the period of time that I think about it now, those people that, you know, initially put their hand up and came to meetings, if you weren't actively engaged in that particular research, they dropped off. They didn't last very long. But those people that were the core were the ones that actually, I suppose, got ahead of what was happening. So my career then started off very, very differently with wanting to be really engaged in clinical work, but then taking on through mentoring and through two very, very powerful women actually, who I suppose gave me the right to be able to be involved in research, and also gave me the knowledge of how to be involved in that research. I didn't have that coming from a teaching background. I was used to imparting knowledge, yes, absolutely, but how do you actually delve? How do you get information from other people? And where that then led me was through establishing eventually my own research group at the School of Psychology, and that was the first research group that was ever established there, and that was the resilience, the lifespan resilience research group. But I felt it was a natural progression. I'd had the training, I'd been mentored, and it was now time for me actually to give back to other staff members within the School of Psychology. The area of resilience really grew out of education, grew out of higher education, because I was trying all the time to think of some way in which I could bring all of this together. What was one word that would cover all of the interests that I had? And it actually happened, I was in 2004 when I had study leave for 6 months, and there was a Time magazine that was published, and on the front of that cover was a heading that said resilience. And I thought, gee, this is quite interesting, might have a look at this. And I read the article, and it was all about Emil Werner, who did all that research in Hawaii in the 60s, and how people survive adversity and why they survive adversity. And I thought to myself, this is actually what we're doing. We're looking at resilience. It's resilience in higher education, it's resilience in kids at school, but that's really what we're doing, is looking at it through across the lifespan. And I came back at the end of 2004 and said, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to establish a lifespan resilience research group, and people that are interested in that could actually join that group. And that was another learning experience for me, and it was bringing together people who had different interests, but who had at the core of them, I suppose, this interest in resilience and how to grow that within the individual. And I started off only in the School of Psychology, but that actually grew so that I now work with people in security and vetting. And we have a huge research project that's going with the School of Security Science. I worked with the School of Nursing, and that has finished, but that was another research project. So it was again, I suppose, mentoring other researchers and growing early career researchers through the establishment of this research group. And what I also learned from that is collaboration. It can be interdisciplinary collaboration and collaboration outside the university. And when I say that, one of the founding, or I suppose moments for me, was attending a conference in Halifax. It was a resilience conference, and the head of the professor then, Michael Unger, who was very interested in what we were doing here at ECU, said to me, would ECU be interested in being the Australian site for my international resilience project? Now, where would I, years ago, have thought that we would ever come to something like that somebody would actually be interested in the research that we were doing over here and would want ECU. And I don't mean that in any derogatory manner, but I just thought of myself as this little research group, and here we were beavering away doing what we do. And yet here was somebody who was actually interested in what we were doing and had read papers that we'd published around the area. And now we are very much associated with the International Resilience Project, which has sites worldwide in America, South America, and ECU is the Australian site for that project. So what started off, I suppose what I really would like to say is that what started off as a career, which really wasn't going to be academic at all, and where I came from, I didn't have the research training. Sure, I did a PhD, and I'm very good at quantitative, qualitative stats. I can do all of that. But how do you grow that then into a career and into a research career where it does make a difference, not only for yourself, but for the institution and for the people that you work with? And I think I'm very, very grateful for the mentors that I've had along the way, especially those two that I've told you about, because I would never be where I am today without those two people who really showed me the ropes and were prepared to give me their time in developing me as a researcher. And I hope that for those of you that are in my faculty, or even if you're not in my faculty, I am more than happy to work with people